You're now no longer talking about airports, you're talking about vertiports, things going up and down, and you can have multiple things going up and down at the same time, right? You don't need long runways.
Then that changes the nature of like the airport model too.
It may no longer just be these big airplanes that you're working on. It may be very different.
Today's guest is Shail Oza, Director of Supply Chain at WestJet Airlines.
It is a very complex industry, obviously, but it is also very exciting, very dynamic. Lots of firefighting that takes place. Everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face, and in an airline, you get punched in the face every hour. That's how it works.
He's led major aircraft programs, rebuilt supply chains from the ground up, and is now helping redefine the future of flight.
Data is coming to us in real time, so an aircraft could be mid-air, and we know that there's a fault on that aircraft. And now, before that aircraft even lands, you could theoretically dispatch a mechanic, a bunch of parts and tools to be on site while the other aircraft is still en route.
There's a lot of new technology out there.
If you think about eVTOL aircraft, if you think about electric aircraft, it's going to require an entirely different supply chain. Going back to 2020, the demand rebounded in a way that nobody predicted. And so the suppliers couldn't just cold start what they had. And so airlines just never really recover from all that.
I wouldn't think the aviation industry would be so far along in electrification. They seem to be big fans of if it works, don't change it.
This is really a battle you have to fight. Because if you don't, I think you're going to be sort of left behind, right? So it's not really being risk averse. This is a matter of sort of survival.
Shail, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to bring aviation in the limelight.
I'm excited to have this conversation because, I mean, boy, it couldn't be more timely, right? We're in this news cycle right now of, losing 10% of the capacity of the aviation system here. So that's going to, I'm sure that's going to be a big overarching thing on our conversation here. But talk about, you just moved from Porter Airlines to WestJet. Tell me about like your new role here and what you did before and what your new role is.
Yeah, happy to. So at Porter, I had a few different roles as I progressed through the years. But in a nutshell, I looked after the reliability of the fleet of airplanes that we had there. So we had a fleet of turboprops and jet aircraft. I was also responsible for the technical procurement. So that's all the parts and tools for the airframes, engines, gears, all that, heavy assets. And the contracts as well. Yeah, it was a lot, but loved it a lot, learned a lot. And now this opportunity came about for me to be the director of supply chain at WestJet. Now WestJet is a very big name in Canadian aviation. The role gives me the chance to supersize my experience, so to speak. So I go from managing, 70 odd airplanes to a much bigger fleet of airplanes and also bigger airplanes in itself. So in my previous role, I looked after regional jets. Here, I might be looking at wide bodies. So I'm really excited to be there. I started in a couple of days, so I'm really looking forward to being there.
When we talk about like running all that for an airline, I mean, like, it's almost like you're running a manufacturing company that changes address every day or every couple hours even,
Yeah.
just in terms of like trying the logistics and the complexity of what you do. Can you speak to like what's all involved there?
Yeah, sure. It's like I said, it's except the manufacturing plant is from place to place to place to place, and that if an aircraft breaks down at where you don't have maintenance, all of a sudden you're now looking at all the complexities involved in moving people to that location, moving parts to that location, moving tools to that location, making sure you have everything you need to be able to fix that airplane so that the passengers can get back home from where they need to, right? So it is a very complex industry, obviously, but it is also very exciting, very dynamic, very operational in nature. So lots of firefighting that takes place, lots of solving problems sort of on the cuff. But it is very exciting. It's a fun challenge to have. Always on the maintenance side of things, but there's a whole other side of airport operations, ground operations, ramp, and dispatch. There's so much that goes behind running an airline that people don't even know about, right? You think about all the pilots and flight attendants that are sort of constantly being onboarded, all the attrition. That requires somebody to manage a whole aspect of all the uniforms for that. And that in itself is a department at every airline that, often people don't think about. Everybody sort of gets on an airplane and you think there's the airplane, there's the pilots, there's the mechanics, there's the cabin crew, and that's about it. But there's so much that goes on behind the scenes. And it's a really fun business to be a part of. And, even though I haven't directly played a role in some of those other aspects of it all, to see that, to witness that firsthand has been fantastic.
So I know like one of the things that you did was you launched a whole brand new fleet type.
Yeah. So in my previous role, my previous employer onboarded a new jet aircraft. that was new to North America. We were the launch customer of that in North America. The jet did operate in Europe already. But yeah, to have that in North America as with us being the launch operator meant that we had to stand up an entire supply chain for that aircraft. And that meant the different logistics corridors. That means a lot of different procurement policies. That meant a lot of different suppliers I've needed to bring on. I mean, in the beginning, it seemed easy because it was so new that there were only a few suppliers, which was the OEMs, right? And so is when you start to go out and look for other support beyond that, that things get very complicated. And it is necessary work that you need to do. So to stand up a supply chain like that, to establish that ecosystem, it takes a lot of effort. And, again, as I was mentioning before, it is a team effort and it takes a lot of different people to be able to make that happen.
I got to imagine, like from what you're describing of your role and the way it all works, launching a new type of aircraft is like starting a whole new business, it seems like. I mean, like there's no established supply chain there. You have to go out and figure all that out, right? I mean, there's nobody helping you with all that stuff, I imagine. You just got to kind of like, here's your plane, go figure it out, right?
Yeah, more or less. I mean, especially when it's a new fleet type, right? When you onboard an aircraft type that is already prevalent in the market, it is a bit of a different story because there are other
Yeah.
partners you can learn from, you can borrow knowledge from, and in the industry, people are, even though we're competitors, we're always good at sharing wisdom. So if it's a fleet type that's in existence, that's already flying, it becomes a little bit easier. But in our case, yeah, it was a fleet type that just didn't exist. And so it's very difficult because, like you said, it is like starting a new business because you have to, beyond just establishing a supply chain, I think when it comes to the personnel, right, the resources on the crew side, on the maintenance side, on the in-flight side, everybody needs to be trained from scratch. And it can be very, very difficult to get all that going in lockstep with where the business wants to go, when they want to launch that service, how that service needs to be launched, what that looks like for your customers. So to get everybody aligned on that can be a pretty difficult process, a very complex process. But I mean, yeah, it's everything from parts, tools, training, branding, marketing. It is a lot of work, and yeah, it is very much like having its own little startup. And that's the feeling we had when I was in my previous employer, where you really were involved with the creation of a new company, so to speak.
Managing a fleet of vehicles isn't just about keeping the wheels turning. It's about data, driver safety, cost efficiency, and most importantly, getting the job done without a hitch. That's where Element Fleet Management comes in. They help businesses from small teams to Fortune 500 companies make smarter decisions about their vehicles. Whether it's electrifying your fleet, cutting maintenance costs, or using advanced analytics to get ahead of issues, Element has the tools and people to make it happen. For more information, visit elementfleet.com today. And to put a finer point on it, I feel what you do and the kind of maintenance you do is incredibly critical, because as we've seen just recently with this UPS incident, if you don't have all those pieces in place and you're not doing the right things, and it's not like a car where your car breaks down, you get out and you walk to, like get somebody to pick you up in an Uber. I mean, you can't just, step outside of an airplane. It's a fundamentally different kind of challenge that involves a lot of people's lives and all that too. So it's a very critical role that you're doing here.
Very much so. And, full respect to all the mechanics that are involved in troubleshooting the aircraft, because it is not an easy task. Every aircraft throws its own challenges. When you talk about a really old fleet type, you kind of have this challenge of the aircraft throwing up snags that never existed before. So, you start to see the aircraft break down in ways that you're not familiar with. So you have to troubleshoot that. If you're talking about working on a new aircraft type, again, these are snags you've never seen before. So you have to learn the aircraft, you have to learn how that works. So, full respect to them. It takes a lot of effort to be able to maintain a fleet like that, you know, and it is difficult, complex, challenging, rewarding work, but it is necessary work that keeps our passengers safe.
You're collecting real-time analytics from these planes, right? So I don't know exactly how it all works, but I mean, theoretically, you could have, a mechanic and parts on a plane heading to where that plane is before that plane even lands. Is that?
Yeah,
that
it
kind
is
of?
theoretically possible. And I think some airlines do it better than others. I think it just depends on the aircraft type. I think E-enabled aircraft, or aircraft that have, health monitoring or engine health monitoring, that's real time. That's not necessarily new. It's how people use that with today's tools. I think there's a lot of data forward tools available for the industry And I think the incorporation of that is what's going to separate, proactive maintenance from reactive maintenance. And I think that data exists. I think it's a matter of how we use that data to make sure that we can be ahead of the problem. So yeah, like you said, the data is coming to us in real time. So an aircraft could be midair and we know that there's a fault on that aircraft. And now before that aircraft even lands, you could technically, theoretically dispatch a mechanic, a bunch of parts and tools to be on site while the other aircraft is still en route. And so you can really minimize the impact of that snag. The delay could be a lot shorter. You might be able to avoid a cancellation because you were able to fix in real time what was going on with the aircraft. So there's huge value in that. And I think
Yeah.
you can't say enough about data and analytics when it comes to maintaining aircraft, but it is the opportunity of the time at the moment.
For you, I got to imagine like the goal is to keep the planes in the air as much as possible. And like every second of downtime, you're essentially losing money if you're not flying these things, right?
Absolutely. And every airline measures something called dispatch availability, which is essentially a measure of how much the aircraft is available for revenue service. Because as you said, when the aircraft's on the ground, it's not making anybody money. When the aircraft's in the hangar, it's not making anybody any money. So yeah, the idea is to keep it free of snags to make sure that it's available to fly at any given time. And so yeah, it is a huge way to make sure you're keeping your revenues intact, to be ahead of any problems that happen, right? To know ahead of time what's going to need to be fixed and to plan appropriately.
And obviously, most of us are sort of used to the 9 to 5 world of, like you drive here and then you
Yeah.
go home. But I mean, like what you're dealing with is like 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, keeping the right amount of inventory, the right amount of staffing to do that. How do you plan for all that?
Yeah, it really is an industry that never sleeps. It is a 24/7 operation. It never really stops. In fact, nighttime can be the busiest at most airlines because that's when the airplanes are, on the ground or in the hangar. So that's when a lot of the attention goes to the aircraft. But yeah, to your question about how we handle all that, I mean, it is a pretty complex exercise. At the end of the day, if I could break it down in a nutshell, when you go buy your car has a maintenance manual that tells you that every 100,000 kilometers, you should go and replace a brake pads or whatever, right? It's similar to that, except when it comes to an aircraft, you have to follow the manual. When you buy your own car, you don't
Yeah.
have to. You can take some liberties with it. When it comes to an aircraft, not so much. So there's a maintenance program associated with every aircraft that every airline has to follow. Airlines go above and beyond the maintenance program in doing some tasks earlier than they should to avoid any kind of other snags, right? So that sort of forms the basis of what dictates your resource requirements. So you kind of know what work needs to happen at what time, at what interval, and how much effort is going to be required to do that work. So based on that, you can figure out what parts you need, what tools you need, where you need them, how much you need them, when you need them, and you can understand what kind of mechanics you need, right? Whether you need structures mechanics, avionics mechanics. So a lot of that information can come up from this maintenance program itself. Where it gets tricky is airplanes don't behave according to maintenance program, right? So things break
Yeah.
outside of that schedule, just like your car, right? Cars break down all the time. They don't necessarily follow what's in the book. And so same thing. So that is what makes it tricky. And that's where you have to strike the right balance of, the right resources for the right problems, because sometimes you may be over resourced, sometimes you may be under resourced. And I think that's a challenge that most airlines struggle with all the time.
You touch on something though that I think is really important for like everybody who's not, maintaining a fleet of planes too, is that proactive maintenance saves you from a lot of those other kinds of headaches, which can be more expensive, increase the amount of downtime and things like that, and keep your staffing and procurement more predictable.
Yep. And we try to do that as much as possible. I think there's always a battle between just in time inventory and just in case inventory. So I think, when you go with a just in time model, you can be lean, but then you're not as resilient. If you are all the, let's buy one of everything just in case we're going to need it, you can be very resilient, but you're not lean anymore, right? You're spending too much money on things you shouldn't have. You have high carrying costs. So it's always this delicate balance that every airline tries to strike. And I think this is where being in an airline environment requires you to be nimble, requires you to be flexible, requires you to be agile, because nothing happens according to plan. Everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face, and in an airline, you get punched in the face every hour. That's how it
Yeah,
works.
there's a
Yeah,
Mike Tyson is just up
that's
there in the
right.
skies, just punching you.
Exactly.
So talking about sort of the parts of things, I mean, you guys have had, I got to imagine, a really tough go of it, since about 2020 in particular, when like you first had, all the supply shortages of the pandemic, and then, we've had various challenges sort of economically, and now here we are in yet another situation where access to all those things is challenging because of the tariff environment, and the supply chain has been kind of massively disrupted, and there's all sorts of things. How is that impacting everything you're doing?
It's impacting everybody pretty greatly. I have to say that most of us in the industry are tired of hearing about the pandemic as an excuse, but it is very much a reality that the pandemic sort of set off a chain of events that we're still trying to recover from. And in between these other shocks, like you mentioned, the geopolitical issues that happened, tariffs, they have not helped. I think the pandemic created a situation where every airline didn't know where air travel was going to go, right? And so demand suddenly plummeted. Everybody said, okay, let's try to preserve cash, see what happens. And so everybody sort of took their hands off and said, we're not going to spend money on, any parts that are out for repairs, or let's leave them at the repair stations until we really have a need for them, until demand recovers. A lot of the industry suffered as a result of that. The major OEMs, they survived it, but it's the sub tiers that they use, right? The mom and pop shops. And when I say mom and pop shop, I mean that relatively in aviation, there's no real mom and pop shop. Everybody's, certified and regulatory approvals. Everybody, it's by the book. But what I mean is it's those sub tiers that really struggle to sort of keep their labor employed to continue to procure parts. And so the bullwhip effect that caused really hampered the industry in a way that we're still struggling from, right? And so airlines took this view that we don't really know what's going to happen with air travel, and it was pragmatic for the time to take that view. As a result of that, a lot of the older fleet was retired. And so, these really, really old airplanes were sort of put out of service, and, they were banished to a desert somewhere to just go sit. And so that didn't really help the situation until all of a sudden the demand rebounded in a way that nobody predicted. It just sort of skyrocketed out of nowhere, right? And so there were these different waves that happened, but once all that was behind us, once it really started to recover, it happened at a rate that nobody predicted. And now all of a sudden,
Yeah.
airlines wanted these parts, they wanted these tools, they wanted everything that they sort of had put on hold. And so the suppliers couldn't spool up their capacity. They couldn't just cold start what they had, right? They had
Right.
laid off people. They had lost a lot of that expertise. They had lost a lot of their place in the line when you talk about the raw materials that they needed to source from everybody, right? So it wasn't easy enough to do. And, as a sort of separate complexity, because the travel rebounded in the way it did, some airlines didn't have enough metal, not enough airplanes to be able to fly these passengers. And so what it did was it created this sort of cottage industry of used aircraft. And the valuations for used aircraft went through the roof. The demand skyrocketed because now the used aircraft that remained that hadn't been sunsetted, that hadn't been retired, all of a sudden there was a pretty big demand for that, right? And so I'll digress a bit here, but I'll say like what that did is it enticed a lot of airlines that own their assets to go and leverage these assets. So think of it as like
Oh,
financing your own home. Think of it as like if you have a house that's paid off, but it's worth a lot in the market. So can you get cheap debt out of it? And so, a lot of airlines took that opportunity. Again, it was the right move for the time, but that cheap debt didn't remain very cheap as interest rates went up, and
right.
as the other geopolitical issues continued, as tariff impact happened, demand now sort of started to plummet a little bit again. So your income statement started to look really bad. Meanwhile, your balance sheet still held all that debt, right? But so it caused this other issue that, was probably good for another podcast. But back to the supply chain issue, what I'll say is another thing about used aircraft is what used aircraft need maintenance and parts. Once again, something the industry didn't have. So it just created more pressure on an already strained system, right? And so
Right.
airlines just never really recover from all that. The geopolitical issues, believe it or not, but war in Ukraine and Russia, you might think is on the other side of the world, but it really
Yeah.
impacted aviation all across the world because those regions were suppliers to aviation. And so one of the major suppliers on one of our aircraft platform, they used to make a component out there. When the issues arose, they couldn't do that anymore. And again, aviation is not the type of industry where you can pivot easily. It is a lot of single
Yeah.
source customers. It is a lot of expertise that is consolidated. And again, that's a decision the industry made as a whole for efficiencies. But the drawback of that was in situations like this, you can't easily pivot and, find another supplier. And so it took them a long time to bring that production back into North America or Europe. And so it didn't really help. And then, again, things were slowly starting to look good, look okay. And then the tariffs hit. And so the tariffs have not really helped. Now, a lot of the aviation goods themselves are exempt from tariffs, but the raw materials that go into them are not necessarily exempt, right? But nobody really understood what the tariffs meant. I remember being in a call with a bunch of like tax lawyers, and they're all just looking at each other. Like, we don't know if this is going to be subject to tariffs. Can you get this certification? Can you get that certification? So there was a lot of uncertainty around that I think we're still recovering from. And I think even though the finished good that becomes an aviation part may not be subject to tariff because the raw materials in them are, the cost for this went up. So again, everybody started to look for a pivot to go procure that somewhere else. But again, it's not easy in the industry to do that, right? So the supply chain has struggled going back to 2020. It slowly recovered in sort of little waves, and then other shocks kept happening that have caused it to continue to be susceptible to other issues. And so airlines today are struggling, and it's affecting more than just the airlines. It's also affecting the manufacturers because they can't pump out new aircraft, right? And so as they can't do that, the market for used aircraft again continues to rise. It creates more uncertainty, and it's a cycle that's sort of continued for a long time.
And the complexity of these planes, I mean, you mentioned like single source suppliers and things like that. I mean, I got to imagine there's just like very unique parts that are
Yeah.
only made in certain places by certain companies that, everybody has to kind of get in line to get, right? I imagine it probably varies between airline manufacturer, how standardized parts are, but I got to imagine there's not a ton of standardization in a lot of that stuff.
No, I mean, yeah, you're right. There isn't. I mean, you can talk about nuts and bolts and you can have some common commercial parts for sure. But I think when you start to talk about the different systems on an aircraft, right? You talk about the avionics, landing gear, the propulsion systems, all of these are sort of manufacturer based. And when an aircraft program is in development, the aircraft manufacturer, whether that's Boeing, Airbus, Embraer, they'll tie themselves up to a design from certain supplier. And so you kind of now become beholden to that, and that is a process that has worked for many years. And as the aircraft program matures, more and more aftermarket suppliers come to light. There are something called PMA parts that come to light. So there's always a little bit of relief as an aircraft program matures, but in the early stages, it's always difficult. And as an aircraft program starts to dwindle, that support goes away as well because now the aftermarket suppliers want to focus on the next shiny thing, right? So in the in between phase, it can be a little bit easier.
Yeah, and then as you mentioned, I mean, like when you're retiring planes, I mean, it's got to be hard for manufacturers then to figure out. It's like one, if you bring a new plane into market, you've got to establish that whole supply chain all over again, right? And by taking the old ones out, it's like then that kind of screws up everybody's calculus of what parts are needed and all that. So I mean, lots to figure out.
That's very much what happened during the pandemic because, again, as I said, the demand plummeted and the airline said, let's take a look at what we have on order. And so whatever was on their order book, they shrunk that significantly because they didn't know whether they were going to need all those airplanes because they didn't know whether air travel would rebound to that magnitude, right? And so not only did that order book shrink, now they didn't have enough metal, so they got more used aircraft, which now extended their need for the new aircraft farther out into the future because now they've already pledged all their capital to a used aircraft that they want on their books for another 4 to 5 years, so they don't need that new aircraft. And so all that made it very difficult for the OEMs to really establish any kind of cadence in terms of aircraft production, right? There were slots that airlines owned that were given up to other folks that were completely taken out, and now the airlines said, no, we want them back. It became very difficult, and I can't imagine being an aircraft manufacturer at the time. Boeing, Airbus, Embraer, De Havilland. I think I can't imagine what it must have been like to be them because it was a very, very strange time, and I think they're still
Yeah.
reeling from it. And so is their supply chain, right? So, like you mentioned, things like wings and skin panels that are required to build an aircraft. Nobody really knew what the demand would look like, and it never really became a smooth curve as it should have been. It always became this sort of up and down, and I still can't imagine what it must be like to be them.
Managing a fleet can feel overwhelming, but not when you have Element Fleet Management on your side. From maintenance and fuel to data analytics and electric vehicle transitions, Element helps businesses keep their fleets efficient, cost-effective, and ready for anything. With decades of industry expertise and cutting-edge technology, they simplify the complex so you can focus on what you do best, running your business. Ready to take your fleet to the next level? Visit elementfleet.com today. This all sounds like you're managing a tremendous amount of data. at the end of the day. I mean, it's how do you wrangle all that data? Like, how do you manage to that?
At least based on what I've seen, I can tell you that I think data is the biggest opportunity for aviation. I think there is plenty of data available for all kinds of analytics, for all kinds of insights. But I think it's a pretty big spectrum in terms of who uses it and how they use it and how well they use it. And I think there's folks on the one end of the spectrum who are still using, spreadsheets to manage a lot of this stuff, and there's folks on the other side who are fully integrated with the best analytics suite you can think of. So I think more people need to move towards the fully integrated analytics suite side of the spectrum because ultimately that's what's going to give you airlines the intelligence they need to react in real time, right? And so specifically when it comes to maintenance, the challenge often is that maintenance is a cost center, right? You don't like to take your car to the mechanic. So the mechanic says, I want more money. You're going to say, no, I'm not going to give you more money, right? So as a cost center, it can be difficult to advocate for investments in improving your systems. And oftentimes it can be challenging to tie that direct benefit straight to a line on the income statement. And I think that's where, the airlines that can create a direct link between the two are the ones most successful in investing in those resources on the cost centers as well. And that's where they see improved revenues down the line as a result of that, right? But I think that is the key here. But I think, yeah, to your point, I think it is a lot of data. It's all kinds of information that the airplanes throw at us, that the airports throw at the airlines, that the passengers throw at airlines. I think CX data is incredible as well. So yeah, it is. The industry is not devoid of information. There's a ton of information available for everybody to act on, and there are really good analytics firms as well that sort of aggregate a lot of this information and provide that to the airlines if they need to understand, operational performance, to understand passenger flow, traffic information. So it is available in the industry. But I think again, individually, how each airline treats that and how much attention and focus they put on it is going to be what separates the good airlines from the okay airlines.
What is it that's preventing, people or companies from, like doubling down on the data and doing it well, like you say? I mean, is there a good playbook for, convincing upper management to make those kind of investments or?
Yeah, I think the playbook is, as I said, if you can tie the opportunity to a line on the income statement, I think then you can show an immediate impact to it, right? And I think that is the playbook because ultimately it might be seen as a cost on a cost center, but that cost is going to give you a benefit. And how does that benefit help you keep the airplanes flying? I think ultimately that's what it comes down to. So if you can tie whatever it is you're advocating for to showing that the aircraft will spend less time on the ground, I think that is the key to, getting the buy-in from, the executive leadership at any place. And I think that is the key differentiator between those who are successful in making that investment and those who are not, right? And I think there's a lot of also distraction in the industry today. I mean, I can personally tell you that I've been approached by so many companies that have the word AI built into what it is that they offer, and all of a sudden they think, okay, we're going to go for it, right? But I think there's a lot of discerning needs to take place before you actually jump into bed with the solution to make sure that it is actually going to help you. So I think there's a lot of that taking place in the industry, and quite frankly, the bandwidth to just assess all of these available solutions, the bandwidth to be able to integrate them with your existing systems, the bandwidth to be able to update you could have archaic technology that you've relied on for the last 30 years, right? If you're an old airline, especially. I think the motivation to switch and to change things, I think sometimes that can be very difficult to come by. But again, the ones who have that motivation are the ones that are actually successful in, sort of navigating this world. But the ones who are a little bit hesitant, who are, they're saying, look, we're happy with the way things are. We don't want to change something that's not broken. We don't want to fix something that's not broken. It is a bit of a difficult uphill battle to climb.
The airline industry is notoriously risk averse. I mean, they're still flying, some places, I'm sure planes from the 60s and 70s, that have been retrofitted and updated and things like that. So, I mean, they seem to be big fans of if it works, don't change it. So like being that change maker has got to be a really challenging place to be in the industry.
Yeah, it is. And I think the risk averse attitude comes with good reason, right? I think safety is
Right.
something you cannot compromise in aviation. And so I think ultimately you don't want to be taking chances you don't need to.
Yeah. I don't want them to change that.
Exactly, right? Exactly. So I think it comes from a good place. And I think there are some who are aggressive, but you kind of have to sort of strike the right balance, right? You don't want to be able to make changes in a way that's not going to be sustainable. You want to make change in a way that is easily digestible to the teams, that's easier for them to accept and adopt and move on with. And I think, to your point, it is a risk averse industry. It comes from a good place, but I think this is not necessarily taking on a risk. This is really a battle you have to fight, because if you don't, I think you're going to be sort of left behind, right? So it's not really being risk averse. This is a matter of sort of survival.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, and on that front, I mean, like I did mention, like the planes that are flying, some of them are really quite old, right? I
Hmm.
mean, because you get along, it's not like a car where, like after 3 or 4 years, you trade it in and get a new one. I mean,
Yeah.
you got to keep these things going because they're big, big capital investment, right? But, that said, there's a lot of new technology out there. How do you see the industry, facing some of these rapid changes in just technology environment in general, and like and the struggles that they have to adopt those things?
Yeah, I think the industry is sort of ripe for innovation. And I think some of these older airplanes that are still in service, I think that to me is a signal that the demand is still there, right? You still need those types of airplanes to fly that, but you don't necessarily need that airplane to fly that, right? And I think in the industry, there's a lot of promising signs of early stage innovation. You have a lot of electric aircraft that are making their way. There's a lot of eVTOL aircraft that are coming into the picture. These are sort of early stage prototypes. A lot of them are proof of concept. Some have already flown. I happen to witness one in downtown Toronto of Beta Technologies.
Oh,
And I
wow.
think that innovation, this is sort of step one. And I think 10, 15 years from now, the industry is going to look very different. I think you're going to see a lot more of these airplanes propagating the industry in a way that is taking away some of the older fleets, because they're more sustainable, they're easier to operate, fewer moving parts. So they're sort of a dream for a mechanic, because you now get to maintain the airplane as opposed to continually fixing it. And so I think that's where a lot of the innovation is going to come through, right? And I think the answer to aviation's problems with respect to the supply chain will come from within aviation. I think you're going to need, like airplanes like this that have fewer moving parts. So they think of an electric car. You're not needing as much maintenance. Same thing. Aviation went from, having, mechanical hydraulic components to fly-by-wire design, and that greatly reduced the complexity of airplanes. And then from the fly-by-wire design, I think the next thing is going to be fly-by-light, fiber optics, or even, AI. There's going to be a lot of sensors everywhere. So I think all of that takes away the complexity of an airplane. And, the easier you make an airplane to operate, the more likely it is that people will adopt that aircraft type, and you'll start to see some early wins, right? Now, I think for the next 10 years, you're still going to go to the airport. You're going to still get in a pretty big airplane. I don't think that itself is going to change anytime soon. I think the need for those giant aircraft is not going to go away. But I think what those aircraft are flying, in terms of the components on them, in terms of the engines that power them, I think a lot of that change will come through. And I think that is where, as I said, there is some promising signs in the industry when it comes to aviation. It's not quite where it needs to be, but it has to start somewhere. And I think it's nice to see that the industry started somewhere.
It's interesting because I wouldn't think the aviation industry would be, so far along in electrification. It's like one of those things you look at it, it's like, oh, they'll be flying those things that way for forever, right? But it's interesting. I mean, like, I want to hear about this all electric aircraft that you got to see. I mean, like, tell me about how did it work? Do you think it makes sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, there's a reason that there's development for this, because there is a market for this, right? And that market might not
Right.
be today or tomorrow, but in the future, there's going to be a market for that. And I think once you can demonstrate that something like that works, it's only a matter of time before somebody finds a way to upsize it and upscale it to the point where it now becomes easy enough to operate for commercial aviation, right? I think at the moment, some of this might be private aviation. At the moment, some of that might be for your last mile logistics, but it is something that there is a need for. And it is also sort of generating a need for an entire infrastructure and ecosystem to support that, right? So if you think about eVTOL aircraft, if you think about electric aircraft, it's going to require an entirely different supply chain to support that, right?
Right.
You're now talking batteries as opposed to sort of heavy actuators, right? So it is going to be a very different supply chain. If you talk about things like drones, right, like RPAS, which is remotely piloted aircraft system, that's a whole sort of industry of its own. You start talking about drones doing a lot of the heavy lifting down the road, and when that happens, you're going to need infrastructure of vertiports. It's going to be like helipad on crack. It's going to be You're going to have a charging infrastructure there. You're going to have, all these drones coming in and out. And I think all that happening in sync all at once while commercial aircraft will still be flying in the air. So, we talked about
Yeah.
the ATC challenges and, the 10% cut. You're going to need an entirely different ecosystem of people managing that layer of aircraft traffic. Who's going to do that if we are already so strained, right? And I think that's where, again, some of the innovation will come from, right? Maybe the systems down the road to operate these new aircraft type might not need to be the same as they are now. There might be a lot of technology that we will leverage, a lot of AI that we might leverage to be able to manage that layer of aircraft traffic. But the point being that I think the need is there. And I think that need is creating this entire sort of industry to create an ecosystem that doesn't exist. And I think that's where a lot of the push is coming from. And I think it's nice to see that's where push is coming from. It may not result in a direct benefit to commercial aviation in the next 2 to 3 or 4 years, but it is a start. And 20 years from now, we might be looking at a very different aviation industry.
I was talking to somebody about the railroad industry, and one of the things, like, rail is a great way to transport goods, but the trick to it is, like, you have to get a certain amount of miles in your train, in terms of, like, the length of your train of goods and stuff, to make that journey valuable. And one of the aspects of, like, improving that is, like, making those loads smaller and efficient, so that you can do multiple small loads rather than having to wait for the big one. And I think that's kind of what you're speaking to here with some of these new technologies, and especially some of, like, the electrification, is, like, rather than having, like, having to fill up a 747 full of cargo, now you fill up a lot of smaller planes that can go all over the place. And the complexity of keeping that airspace safe is going to be really challenging.
100%. And I think the whole last mile delivery system will look very different, right? Whether that's drones picking up your Panera order or, doing blood delivery. So, I mean, I learned about this in school recently about this company called Zipline in Africa that does delivery of different blood types to different hospitals from a centralized location using drones. It's not a idea. It is a well executed business model that is already working. And I think that is, again, a sign of early stage adoption, which is promising to see. It is somewhat easier in those environments without the regulatory oversight. And so I
Yeah.
think sometimes that can be, I don't want to call it a burden, but I think it can sometimes slow things down. And again, for good reasons.
It ends up being a little bit of a test bed for innovation, I guess,
Exactly, right. And so I think it is nice
for
that these
better or worse.
geographies, yeah, so it is good that these geographies are sort of available to you to do these testing, because it does help you generate data that the regulatory agencies here look at as a means to allow you to do business here. So yeah, it is going to be complex, but I think, yeah, we're on our way. It's not, the industry's not sitting by. There's different players that are doing this. And I think the next step will be for these players to sort of talk to each other, right? So I think you've got a last mile delivery system and you've got your airlines flying your heavy metal, right? Someday they're going to want to sit down with each other and say, how can we help each other? I think when that happens, that's when you're really going to see, like, an uptick in innovation and, a sort of different direction that aviation goes into.
There's so many different directions this could go into. I mean, like, we talked about the idea that, smaller electric vehicles, but I mean, do you see maybe the start of this? Like, you mentioned sort of the engines and that sort of thing. Do you think that they would retrofit some of these older planes with electric engines, or how would all that work?
I don't think that the older aircraft could be retrofitted with these engines, and maybe there's a world in which that could happen. But I think more or less you're talking about new aircraft. You're talking about new airplanes leaving the production lines that need to be bought by these by airlines to be able to demonstrate that willingness from the customer side.
I get asked 1,000 times going through the airport, do you have any lithium ion batteries in your luggage? So do you feel like there's going to be a need for new battery technology? And like, do you think the technology is there, or do you think there's stuff that's still missing from that technology portfolio?
Well, I think there is technology there that companies are using today to be able to demonstrate these ideas and these designs. But I think the technology will certainly need to change to be able to adapt to large scale commercialization, right? To be able to ramp up to what eventually the industry needs, right? In 20 years from now, just read a study that says transportation and logistics in Canada alone will be worth a $20 billion market using
Wow.
remotely piloted aircraft. So I think with the existing ecosystem, there's a reason it's not moving as fast as it should be because there are limitations on, raw material for batteries and, how much of that is being looked at by other industries as well. So yeah, 100%. I think that today technology is there, which is allowing the development, which is allowing the proof of concept, which is allowing the prototypes, but there will need to be an evolution there as well to different systems that are more efficient in terms of, power capacity, in terms of being able to provide the endurance and range you need to be able to meet aviation travel the way it needs.
When we're talking about some of these new technologies, the eVTOLs,
Yeah.
then that changes the nature of like the airport model too. You don't have everything kind of spoke and hub. It's kind of very distributed then. I mean, what's your thoughts on that?
It is, as I said, it's going to require an entirely different set of infrastructure, right? Because to your point, you're now no longer talking about airports, you're talking about vertiports, or things going up and down, and you can have multiple things going up and down at the same time, right? You don't need long runways, you don't need that real estate that you initially would have required. But on the flip side, now what you need is an entirely different system of, charging infrastructure. You need battery capacity. You need to have perhaps data centers to be able to, look at what data these are producing, right? And so it is going to be a very interesting pivot in terms of how the industry manages this and where we see this go. So there are some early pilots, especially in the Middle East, with Archer Aviation. I think there's a lot of flying taxis and et cetera that are being contemplated, that are being very much signed into existence with letter of
Yeah.
intent and everything else. So, and that's only a few months away in terms of at least a promised launch date. So we'll know very soon how that works and what that's going to take. But yeah, it is very interesting in that is where the opportunity for today's youth is. So if you're in school today and you're thinking, what does aviation, I'm interested in aviation, what's that going to look like in 20 years from now? That's what it's going to look like. It may no longer just be these, big airplanes that you're working on. It may be very different, but it is still going to be very exciting. It's going to be very cool, and it's going to be challenging and complex at the same time, but very rewarding.
Well, it seems like in that kind of a world, the infrastructure is going to become sort of the main focus rather than sort of the flights. Because I mean, I gotta imagine if you have a more distributed environment with all these VTOLs, I mean, you could literally, if you had, like an acre, you could probably set up an airport if you don't have to have long runways and all that too, right? I mean, you could have a lot more regional airports, and I mean that changes the whole nature of everything then, right?
Yeah, you could. Yeah, absolutely. You could certainly offer launch pads out of your backyard if you've got the room for it, right? I don't know. Maybe there's an opportunity to commercialize any kind of open space you've got pending. But yeah, that creates that opportunity. But what it also means is you can now have these launch pads in remote areas where it's difficult to establish a runway, where it's difficult to land airplanes, right? And now, especially in the Canadian North, you might be able to provide essential life-saving supplies at a much cheaper cost. You don't need to, like you said, you don't need to fill up a 737 to be able to fly into a remote community that has to go through an ice road, that has to go through all this stuff. You can make that a lot more simple. You can make it very point to point if you want. And you're now giving the resources to who needs it, as opposed to sending it all to one place that might not need it, but that's the easiest location, and now you got to distribute from there, right? So yeah, you can definitely change that model completely. And yeah, it may well be an infrastructure play, down
Yeah.
the road. It may no longer be just about aviation, but it is about how you support that infrastructure of aviation.
The last mile in that has a very different sense because, like you said, we're going to airports and then it gets on a truck and then it goes to a distribution facility and it gets on another truck and then it gets on a delivery. It's like, so there's a lot of steps there. But if you could just, fly the parts from Canada to the, manufacturing plant right in the United States where it's going to all get assembled, that changes the whole thing.
It could, yeah, and I think we're a few years away from that. But yeah, that is ultimately what is needed because right now, even the auto companies, for example, when they need a part to fix something on their production line, they're using charter aircraft, expensive $70,000-$100,000 aircraft for what could be a $10,000 part, and so it is not the most efficient use of their budget. So I think things like this will really transform how every business, not just aviation, but every business looks at their last mile delivery model to see how can we improve this? How can our logistics be more streamlined? And I think, yeah, we're a few years away from that, but that is where there's a ton of opportunity.
People like you are going to be in high demand in those sorts of situations.
I hope I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong in that. I hope it's not a few years away. I hope it's sooner than that.
in that world, the logistics challenges become amazing. Then that's wild to think about.
But yeah, I think in that world, you really need a fleet management expertise at that point, and that takes on a whole other meaning, right? Talking about the fleet podcast, it becomes a fleet management challenge, a fleet management business case, and a model to solve and optimize for. For anybody in the industry that wants to look at that and say, what is the best model? An airline is hub and spoke. You can have all these different things, but what does that look like for eVTOL aircraft? What does that look like for drones? What does that look like for other RPAS aircraft type?
It's interesting, like in terms of sort of the fleet management side of it. I mean, there's already demand for this, and there's probably going to be greater demand in the future. Like, what's your advice for folks who wanted to maybe they're already fleet managers, but they're managing vehicle fleets or something like that, and they want to get into your business? Like what would you say to them?
Honestly, so I was surprised to learn this myself, but a couple of months ago, I attended a seminar that an industry partner put on about sort of innovation in Canada about when it comes to aviation. And what I didn't realize is how much research is already out there from Transport Canada, from FAA, from EASA on these different aircraft systems, on these different aircraft infrastructure models, on how these systems will behave in different environments and different weather conditions, and what might be required in different airspace to facilitate this, what might be required at different altitudes to facilitate this. So my advice to anybody who's interested in this is to just look it up and do that research that already exists. It's not a matter of you have to go and commission a study. A lot of work already exists. I would say my advice would be just read up on that. And I read up a few of them myself. I was amazed to see how far ahead the industry is in terms of anticipating some of the challenges that are going to come with these models, with this type of innovation. It's really encouraging to see that there's already some resources being committed to this, that there's already a lot of research dollars, tax dollars going to this. And it's really, really sort of refreshing. And I would definitely encourage everybody to go and read up on that.
Maybe I'm just nerdy guy or whatever, but I'm excited for like what the future of aviation is going to look like. I mean, it sounds like, one, there's tremendous business opportunity in it for one thing, but it sounds like it's going to be, if we can reinvent aviation, it's going to be a really interesting world we're going to be living in, right?
Absolutely. And I can't wait to see what this looks like, 20 years from now, and maybe we can do another follow-up at the time. But
Yeah,
it's going
for
to be a very
sure.
different industry. Yeah.
Yeah, well, and like you're the one who's got to bring it to us. So, keep working hard on that, right? So, if people wanted to find you, how would they reach out to you?
LinkedIn. LinkedIn is the best way to get a hold of me. Shail Oza. There's not many of us there, so it'll be easy to find.
Thanks so much for being on. I mean, I feel like I wish we had more time because there's like 1,000 more questions I have. Maybe we need to do a part 2 at some point on this because
Yep.
it's a really fascinating industry to me. And thanks so much for sharing your insights on this. I really appreciate it.
No problem. Happy to share again. I was happy to bring some limelight onto aviation. So thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.